Hello, I'm Jamie with the Volusia County Public Library. In this video, you will learn how to take the beginning steps in painting with watercolors by practicing some basic techniques. You will need the following: watercolors, painter's tape or masking tape, a piece of cardboard or another hard surface that you can tape your paper down to, watercolor paper. I took my full sheet, 9 by 12, and cut it in half for this exercise. Some brushes, a container of water, and a pencil. A bit about the materials before we get started. All of these materials come in a variety of grades and qualities and a large price range. For beginners like us, it's totally fine to get student grade and on the lower price range of things to get started. We're not going to be creating any masterpieces right off the bat. You can get student quality brushes and paints. I do, however, recommend making sure that you get a decent quality watercolor paper, as that will affect your painting, the way your brushes and your pigments work on the paper. Watercolors come in 3 main formats: dried cakes, like I have here in a palette. You can get them in tubes of individual colors, and you can also buy liquid pigments. Each type has its own pros and cons. I opted for the dried cake pigments that came in a palette with a variety of colors because I didn't want to choose my individual colors to create my own palette. I felt that this was more friendly as a beginning painter. But you can look into each option and choose which looks most exciting for you to work with. You can even start with the simple 8-color watercolor set that like grade school kids have. That's totally a great set for beginners as well. Let's get started. We're going to start by taping our watercolor paper onto our hard work surface. I'm using the painter's tape and a piece of cardboard. We're going to want to tape a small border on all 4 edges. This will help keep our paper from warping while we paint. So just a small kind of border to paint on there. We're not going to be painting right to the edge of the tape, so I'm not too worried about keeping the same distance all around on my painting. For when you're actually using the whole paper, you're going to want to be a little more aware of how much you're taping on each side. So for this exercise, it's just to hold our paper in place and try and keep everything flat. So first we're going to talk about 2 different techniques for painting with watercolors: wet on dry and wet on wet. I'm going to go ahead and take my pencil, and I'm just going to kind of roughly draw in 2 rectangles here, kind of looking at my page half and half. So 2 kind of longer rectangles on 1 half. And our first one's going to be wet on dry, and then we're going to do wet on wet. So I'll go ahead and label those. So we're going to start with the wet on dry. And we're going to take our brush. I like to use a round brush for this exercise, but you can use the flat brush if that's what you have on hand, whatever kind of brush. Because I'm painting a larger area, I also opted for a larger size brush. So we're going to get it nice and wet in our water, and you're going to choose which color you'd like to use. So this is just a beginning exercise. Choose your favorite color. I would stick with the same color for both of these exercises just so you can see the difference at the end when it's dry a little clearer. So when your brush is nice and wet, you're going to choose which color you want to use, and we're going to activate our pigment. So I'm going to go ahead and do this purple here today. So I want to activate my dry pigment here and load my brush with pigment. You might need to come back and get some more water. This also depends on what kind of watercolor pigments you've decided to use if you went with the dry cakes like this. If you have the liquid pigments, obviously you don't need to do this part, they're already wet. And when you feel like you've got a good amount of paint on your brush, we're going to go ahead, your brush is the wet and the paper is our dry. So we're just going to go ahead and paint that rectangle. So this is kind of time to just kind of play with the different ways you can hold your brush. We don't need to stay inside the boundaries of the rectangle. Feel free to pick up more water if you need to. This is just for you kind of to see what the paint does when you paint on dry paper. So you can see after I've painted, I can take the brush and kind of move the pigment around. And I have my rectangle fully painted. I'm going to go ahead and switch brushes so I don't have to clear that one off. I'm going to use my flat one to do our wet on wet. You can use the same brush if you just have one. I just happen to have two on hand, so to keep it easy, I'm just going to use this one. I'm going to get it wet, and I'm not going to put it in any pigment. I'm just going to take the water straight to the paper and paint the water onto the rectangle. So this is creating our wet paper that we're then going to put our wet paint on. You don't want to get it soaking wet, but you want it to kind of glisten. You want to be able to see that there's water on there. So depending on the space that you're doing wet on, you might need to move quickly for this kind of painting. All right, so I can kind of see it glistening there in the light. I'm going to go back to my round brush, get a little more water to pick up some pigment, and then I'm going to add the second wet. So you can see right away when I touch my brush, the pigments start spreading because the paper is already wet. And you can see here where I got wet outside of the rectangle, that pigment's going to spread along through the water. So again, you want to move a little quickly so that water doesn't dry up on you. You can always go back and pick up more paint if you need to. You can see it spread through the water. So you're going to paint your rectangle. Like that. And then you can go ahead and clean off your brush. So I have a sample of the same activity that I did earlier. So this is already dry, so you can see the difference. So when we do the wet on dry, you see more of the brush strokes and can kind of get a darker, brighter pigment to your color. And when you do the wet on wet, it's going to be a smoother, kind of softer look. There's not a right or a wrong way, they're just different techniques to use watercolor. So you kind of think of how you'd like your end product to look when it's dry. It's a little harder to see when it's still wet. So when it's dry, and you can kind of feel the brush strokes even where this is a smoother feel to it. So for our last exercise today, we're going to paint a gradient, which is a kind of common watercolor technique. So we're going to start with a dark, more saturated color at the top, and then work our way to a very light, almost no color at all at the bottom. So you can use the same color that you did for our wet on dry and our wet on wet, or you can opt to use a different color if you'd like. I'm going to go ahead and stick with the same color that I have here. So I'm going to make sure my brush is nice and wet, activate some more of my paint here, and pick up a decent amount. Now you could draw a rectangle here if you want to. I'm just going to free form kind of a rectangle shape. So I'm going to pick up some pigment, and I'm going to start at the top of my paper, put my brush down and go across, and come across again, making like a zigzag pattern. So you can already see that I'm pretty much out of water and pigment at this point. So I have a dark up here and I get down to nothing there. So I'm going to get my brush wet again. We kind of repeat this process a couple of times. And even though I have a decent amount of pigment up here, I want to start and make sure that that's the darkest part of my gradient. And then add more as I move down. If I need to, I can dip in water, but not paint again, and continue moving down the paper. I did choose a lighter color, so it's probably really hard to see, but I do have a little bit of purple even down there still. With just my damp brush, I can come back and pick up some of that pigment at the top and just lightly bring it down. And it doesn't have to be totally perfect. It's you're just going from this darker and making your way down to this almost nothing. And if you find like, oop, that's maybe a little darker than I want down there, you can dip your brush in the water to pick up more water, and that will lighten up that pigment, and you can drag it down or kind of drag it up with your brush. When you have just that wet brush, it almost kind of acts as a vacuum for the pigment and can kind of suck some up off your paper there. And this is just an activity, practice and activity, so it doesn't need to be perfect. It's something you can play with, try with your different colors. It's a great way to find out what your different colors look like as you're painting. So you can see I have my dark, and it goes all the way down to my almost white, just the paper, as it's fading, fading, fading. So as it dries, it will look more like this. So I have the very dark pink fading down into this very light pink. So it's all the same pigment, it's just how much pigment or paint we had as we work our way down, where we have more water than paint here and more of an equal balance up here where it's dark. I hope you have enjoyed learning how to start exploring with watercolors. If you're interested in more watercolor ideas and techniques, you can check out these books and more at your library, as well as the Creative Bug database. In my next watercolor video, we're going to talk a little about color theory and make a color chart from the colors on our palette. And remember, stay crafty, Volusia.